Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. I want to give a special shout out to Professor Tom Knox students who are here. How many of you are Tom Knox students here? Professor Knox students? Fantastic. It's great to see so many students here, so many friends, so many teachers and others. I'm really delighted that we're having this event. This is part of a larger grant that we run between a variety of universities in Texas and the National Endowment for the Humanities and Humanities Texas. And I want to begin, before I say anything else, by thanking those who have made this event possible. I want to thank the Center for Presidential History here at SMU and the SMU campus, the History Department, and others. I want to thank Humanities Texas. And Will in the back is from Humanities Texas here. They are our National Humanities Council here in the state of Texas. They do fantastic work in keeping the humanities alive, helping teachers and students and citizens think and understand the humanities. And then I want to thank my own institution, the University of Texas at Austin. We are the sort of co-members of this grant. I'm Jeremy Suri. I'm a professor at UT. And I do a lot of work with Humanities Texas, which is how I'm involved with this. Mike Gillette, the director of Humanities Texas, and I, a number of years ago, were thinking about ways in which we could take the humanities work we were doing, the work to showcase history, literature, the arts, and bring that to broader communities. And the National Endowment for the Humanities at that point had put out a call for proposals for grants that would bring the humanities into the public square. And so we immediately thought that this was an opportunity for us to do this, and that elections, the history of elections, was an appropriate way to do this. Why? Because elections are not simply about the candidates and not simply about the issues of that moment. They're about the fundamental humanistic elements of democracy, about participation, about citizenship, about civics, things you could forget about if you just listened to the coverage of the elections. But the elections themselves are about that. There's nothing more democratic than citizens going out and expressing their viewpoints on the future of their society. Nothing could be more central to the humanities, to the notion of citizenship and participation. And we thought that showcasing the history of American elections, not because the elections of the past were better or worse than those today, but because there were enduring elements of presidential elections that matter for all of us, would be a great way to connect the humanities to our current moment and hopefully bring more people in. The National Endowment for the Humanities wants me to say that this is part of a nationwide initiative funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities aimed at fostering meaningful dialogue in communities about the most pressing issues of the day. They are doing similar programs in other states on race. On other forms of citizenship, we're doing elections, of course. The NEH believes that the perspectives of the humanities, history, literature, and philosophy can be brought to bear on our current challenges and help us better understand the context and complexity of the issues we face today. Hello, Professor Gouldy. How are you? Nice to see you. So we chose the elections we chose for this grant, in part because we felt that there were elections in our past that are not covered deeply enough, that we don't know enough about. Elections that have a lot to tell us about the way our society has developed, and elections that have enduring meaning for us. And I have to say that this is going to be, I think, my favorite of all the events we do around the state. We're doing about 12 of these events, I think. This today is going to be my favorite event, not only because we have the super best professors presenting and the super best audience, but because the 1912 election is my favorite election. It really is, and I think you'll know why by the end of the presentations today. I just want to say a few things to set the stage. I want to tell you why it's my favorite election. This is what I was telling my kids last night before they stopped me from continuing to go on and on, as I tend to do. The 1912 election had four of the most extraordinary figures in American political history. Four of them, all four of them. Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Eugene V. Debs. Each of those four figures is worthy of being called a great figure in his own right. Doesn't mean flawless, but a great figure in his own right. I know you all know a lot about Wilson. I know you all know a lot about Theodore Roosevelt, and you'll hear a lot more about them. I want to say a little bit about Taft and Debs, just to give you a sense of how the understudies, those who are not as famous as the top two, are themselves so significant. William Howard Taft, I would argue, and the presenters today might disagree with me, I would argue William Howard Taft was probably the most influential American of the late 19th, early 20th century. This man served as Governor General of the Philippines, Governor General of Cuba, Secretary of War, President of the United States, and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. All of these things. That's actually more offices than almost anyone has held at that level. If you think about the imprint he had upon American society, he was one of the 4 candidates. He was, in fact, the incumbent as president. And then Eugene V. Debs, who we'll hear a lot about today, was a socialist who won 1 million votes, or just about 1 million votes in the United States. So much for there being no socialism in the United States. These 4 figures, Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Debs, they not only set a mark, an enduring mark on American society, they not only imprinted the society, culture, and politics of our society, they persuaded millions of voters. And what's fascinating about the 1912 election is that none of them won a majority. We're usually a winner-take-all society in every way. 1912 was not winner-take-all. Wilson won 41.8% of the vote. Theodore Roosevelt, 27.4%. William Howard Taft, 23.2%. And Eugene V. Debs, 6% of the vote. Wilson won 6 million, more than 6 million votes. Theodore Roosevelt, 4 million. Taft, 3.5 million. Debs, almost 1 million votes. If you did your math, you realize that the 2 ostensible Republicans, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, had more votes than Wilson. So in fact, coming out of this election, you had a splintered Republican Party. This should sound familiar to all of you. And you had 4 candidates, 3 of whom had viable votes to be president. Any of those 3. There are different ways you could run this scenario, and you have Theodore Roosevelt serving his 3rd term, or you have William Howard Taft serving his 2nd term. So this outcome was by no means foreordained, and Eugene V. Debs not winning or coming close to winning had an enormous impact, particularly upon workers in American society and immigrants, and we'll hear more about that as well. One other point I want to make. The election could have been very different, not simply because of the national level, but at the state level as well. I want to take 2 states, one of whom is very important this year, Ohio. In Ohio, in 1912, Wilson won 41% of the vote. Theodore Roosevelt won 22% of the vote, and William Howard Taft won 26% of the vote. So actually, in Ohio, if Taft and TR had combined their votes, they would have won the state, which would have flipped the electoral votes as well. So it's not just about the popular vote. Why do I make these points? Because American elections are not about Democrats running against Republicans. They're not about 2 people, and they're not about the same old, same old. What elections offer, not every election, but what many elections offer are 3 possibilities, and this is what I'm going to close on. They offer the possibility for new figures to emerge. Woodrow Wilson was a new figure to emerge. Professor Knock has written more about him and better than anyone else, and that's who Wilson is, a figure who comes, in a sense, out of nowhere for many people. So elections offer an opportunity for new figures to arise, opportunity for figures who might be out of the mainstream, like a Eugene V. Debs. Elections, secondly, are uncertain. We never know what's going to happen. They're like wars. We think we know the outcome before the 2 armies actually clash on the battlefield. And that's true about the 1912 election, about so many others. And third, and most important, really the point I want everyone to remember today, it's not just that the winners have influence, so do the losers. In fact, often the losers in elections have more influence than others. You could argue that William Jennings Bryan, who was not elected in 1896, had more influence upon social and political legislation in the United States in the early 20th century than in some ways William McKinley. And you could argue that coming out of 1912, the later policies pursued by Woodrow Wilson and others were deeply influenced, by Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Eugene V. Debs, even though none of the 3 of them was elected in that particular election. Our elections are not simply about who wins. They're about the rhetoric, the policy platforms, and the groups that are mobilized during the process of the electoral season. And I think we'll hear a lot more about that today. I'm excited that we can talk about this as history. We're not here to talk about Trump or Clinton. But we are here to talk about why it's important to put our elections in historical perspective. And I really want to close by emphasizing we're here about getting everyone involved in thinking about politics. So please register to vote and vote. Take away the lesson today that votes matter. Even votes among young people matter. Register to vote, go out and get other people to vote, and tell them why 1912 is so awesome. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Brian, who's our MC and facilitator here.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you all for being here. We're really excited to be able to host this. He gave a great introduction to the election here and the work of Humanities at Texas. And so I just want to give a few instructions about how the event's going to go and some of the logistics of today, okay? As he said, my name is Brian Franklin. I am the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History here at SMU and an adjunct professor in the History Department. Now, our format for today's event is relatively simple. I think you have a schedule there, and I'll just help explain it a little bit as you're looking at it. So first, our three panelists today will each give a presentation on some particular aspect of the campaign and the election of 1912. After all three have concluded, we will then break out into breakout sessions, okay? These breakout sessions will be led by each of our three panelists from today, and those will be for diving a little deeper into some primary source documents, time for you to ask questions that were sparked in your mind from their presentations, to go just a little bit deeper in those things. There will be three to choose from, and you will have the opportunity to choose two of them to go to. So one of them you'll see is marked there will start at about 4:40, and the other one, about a half hour later, will start about 5:15. So it will be up to you to choose which of the two you would like to attend, in which order you would like to attend them. And for your information, if you have a pen or a pencil, I don't think this is written on the program, but Kenyon Zimmer will be in room 115, Tom Knock will be in room 116, and Crista Deluzio will be in room 152. There will be several staff members from the Center for Presidential History and Humanities Texas around to help guide you down. But essentially, you'll go down to the first floor. 115 and 116 are on one side, and 152 is on another side. And then there will also be staff that will come by your rooms, panelists, to help you, let you know when time is about out. Now, on to our panelists, so you can stop listening to me so much. We are really privileged to have them here. I was just telling someone before the event, it was such great serendipity to have such great specialists in this sort of time period and in their subjects that are just right here local in DFW. So first, we're going to hear from Kenyon Zimmer. Dr. Zimmer is an associate professor of history at UT-Arlington. He is the author of, most recently, Immigrants Against the State, Yiddish and Italian Anarchism in America. He's currently working on two other projects, one on the deportation of immigrant radicals after World War I, and another on a global history of the industrial workers of the world. And he'll be presenting today on Eugene Debs and socialism around 1912. Our second guest is Thomas Knock. He's the interim director of the Center for Presidential History and Altshuler Distinguished Teaching Professor here at SMU. He's written widely on the field of 20th century politics and foreign policy, including the book To End All Wars, Woodrow Wilson and the Quest for a New World Order, and his most recent book, The Rise of a Prairie Statesman, The Life and Times of George McGovern. And our final panelist is Crista Deluzio, Associate Professor of History and Altshuler Distinguished Teaching Professor, also here at SMU. Dr. Deluzio specializes in the history of childhood, family, women, and gender in the United States, an excellent background for talking about the role of women in the election of 1912. She's the author of the book Female Adolescence and American Scientific Thought, and the editor of a couple others, including Borders of Love and Power, Families and Kinship in the Intercultural American Southwest. Now, after all three presenters have had a chance to speak one by one, I'll come back up here with instructions to help us move along from there. So will you join me in welcoming our first guest, Kenyon Zimmer?
Thank you very much. Let me just make sure I have a timer here for myself. All right, so it is rather serendipitous that I am here in 2016 to talk about the election of 1912, as both elections have featured socialism, or at least what people were describing as socialism or social democracy or democratic socialism, in a relatively unprecedented manner. Although 2016 is not as unprecedented as some people may think if we look back to 1912 and the figure of Eugene V. Debs. So what I want to focus on in my time right now is how and why a relatively large-scale socialist movement emerged in the United States in the years leading up to the election of 1912. and what exactly socialism meant to those involved. So American working class life in 1912 was one in which the average work week in American manufacturing was 57 hours a week, which, right, by today's terms, that's more than 2 extra 8-hour work days added to your 5-day work week. Child labor was widespread. Almost 19% of American workers were under the age of 15, and this is wage-earning workers. So child labor is widespread, perfectly legal. And the United States, in part because of the way that legal liability laws worked, had the highest rate of industrial workplace accidents and deaths in the industrializing world, in part because employers were not legally liable for injury or death of their employees. Each year in the decades leading up to this election, 500,000 workers in the United States were injured per year, and an average of 35,000 were killed on the job. It was also an era coming, right, with the second industrial revolution in the United States of unprecedented wealth. But that wealth was not evenly distributed. If we look up here in our area in 1912, income inequality was at a very high point, although it would rise leading up to the Great Depression and the stock market crash, but a very high level of income inequality. So those workers working in dangerous conditions, working 6 or 7 days a week, were not really seeing the fruits of their labor go to themselves. Coincidentally, recent decades have seen a similar rise in income inequality. And unsurprisingly, the decades leading up to 1912 were decades of increasing labor unrest, of workers forming unions, going on strike, rioting in some cases, demanding better conditions, better wages, shorter hours, and so on. We can see with each 5-year period in the late 19th and early 20th century, the number of average number of strikes per year rose significantly leading up to this. Which leads us to Eugene V. Debs and the Pullman strike of 1894, which was one of these very significant industrial disputes. Debs was the founder of the American Railway Union, a union for all workers on American railroads. Now, Debs himself was born in 1855 in Terre Haute, Indiana. His father was actually a small businessman, but Debs worked in the railroad industry. And in 1893, the year before the strike, helped found this, what was at the time one of the largest unions in the United States. In 1894, 500,000 members of the railway union went on strike against the most powerful corporations in the United States at that time, which were the railroads. Railroads were the first large corporations in American history, and they were really the industrial and economic powerhouses of the day. The strike spread to 27 states. It brought train traffic throughout the country to a virtual standstill, which meant, given the era, it also brought the transportation of people and goods to a virtual halt. The railroad owners were able to seek court injunctions against the strike. The strike was declared illegal. Ironically, under the Sherman Antitrust Act, it was declared a conspiracy against trade and commerce, and Debs and the other strike leaders were imprisoned after they refused to call off the strike. Federal troops were dispatched to break the strike after railroad owners seized upon the idea of attaching U.S. mail cars to as many trains as possible, because then preventing those trains from moving became a federal offense, interfering with the federal mails, and therefore the federal government was forced to intervene, sent in 12,000 federal troops on American soil, and in various skirmishes with the railroad strikers, U.S. federal troops killed 13 American citizens and wounded 57 others. This is also, ironically, how we end up with Labor Day as a holiday, because President Grover Cleveland at the time, it's his apology to the labor movement for sending in federal troops to kill American workers because he was elected with the backing of organized labor. Now, Debs is imprisoned as a result of the strike, and it's in prison that he becomes more radicalized, that he begins to turn towards socialism and socialist ideas, reading both native American writings on socialism, like the works of Edward Bellamy, but also reading people like Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. The strike basically disillusions Debs with the workings of the American economy and government as they existed at the time. He goes on to very quickly rise as the single most prominent American socialist figure, and in 1901, he co-founds the Socialist Party of America. Now, this is a democratic socialist party. What does that mean in America in 1912? It means, one, right, this is not an organization looking for armed revolution or seizing power. This is an organization that's looking to achieve success through the democratic process and to, in fact, keep a democratic, or even if you read the 1912 party platform that some of you have, a significantly more democratic system of government than existed at the time, or even than exists today. For instance, one of the things they posed was the Electoral College. And their goals were quite radical nevertheless. Their ultimate goal was public ownership of the means of production, of factories, of land, of railroads, to be run for use and not for profit, which ultimately meant, very explicitly, the end of capitalism as we know it. That was their goal. But to achieve these things through and under a democratic republic as already existed in the United States. So quite different than, say, Lenin or Stalin's notions of dictatorship of the proletariat was not part of this program. Quite different than the democratic socialism of Bernie Sanders, which is, as articulated in the past couple of years, nowhere near as radical as this, right? I mean, they were explicitly wanting to do away with capitalism as we know it. In 1905, Debs also was a co-founder of another very important organization, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, which was a revolutionary industrial union. Similarly, very radical goals, but also at the same time served as a union to gain better wages and conditions for workers. But with the program that class struggle between workers and employers must go on until workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the earth and the machinery of production, and abolish the wage system. That is, its end goal also was abolition of capitalism and wage slavery, as they termed it. However, their strategy differed from that of the Socialist Party. They believed in direct action rather than electoral voting. Their ultimate goal was a general strike of all workers to go on strike simultaneously and simply seize the means of production and begin producing for themselves. And ultimately, these two conflicting strategies drove a wedge between the two organizations, as we'll get to in a second. But the Socialist Party of America grew dramatically leading up to 1912. And it had some surprising sources of support, like West Virginia miners or Southwestern farmers, as well as immigrant industrial workers in places like New York, Chicago, and so on. In Texas, the Socialist Party enjoyed, by today's standards, surprising success. And that success was rooted in tenant farmers. At first, white tenant farmers, but then branching out to African American and Mexican American tenant farmers. So these are farmers who didn't own their own land, and therefore the idea of socializing the land that they didn't own anyway wasn't that foreign, and they wouldn't be gouged in rent and so on. They formed, under socialist auspices, the Texas Land Renters Union to fight for tenant farmers' rights. And a number of these farmers actually came out of the populist movement of the 1890s, which had also demanded public, that is, government ownership of railroads and granaries in order to have those industries cease gouging farmers for transporting and storing their produce, which was also part of the Socialist Party's program. Thomas Hickey, an Irish immigrant, was the foremost socialist in the state of Texas. He edited a paper called The Rebel, which ran from 1911 to 1917, was the third largest socialist paper in the country, with a circulation of over 20,000 copies per issue. and was one of several hundred socialist newspapers and magazines published throughout the country. And if you look at this map, you'll see there's a lot in places like Texas and Oklahoma, as well as the Midwest and the Northeast and so on. In the years leading up to and shortly after 1912, the Socialist Party also had a lot of electoral success at the local level, electing public officials, everything from city aldermen all the way up to state representatives, and even, as we'll see in a moment, a couple of congressmen. This map here is showing cities and towns that elected socialists to mayor between the years 1911 and 1920. There are so many in the Great Lakes region that it's blowing up here. Yes, so dozens and dozens of cities and towns had Socialist Party mayors. The city of Milwaukee, with a couple of interruptions, had Socialist Party mayors from 1910 until 1960. And the Socialist Party had two members of Congress, Victor Berger and Mayor London, who, prior to Bernie Sanders, who technically was an independent, were the only self-identified socialists elected to U.S. Congress prior to Sanders. So, there is momentum building. There's a lot of electoral success at the local level, even at the national level, in some regards, with Victor Berger and Mayor London. The IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, has also grown apace since its founding. It's got about 100,000 members by 1912, and it is prominently in the nation's mind and newspaper headlines that year. It's leading a bitter free speech fight in the city of San Diego, where fire hoses are being used against protesters fighting for the right to speak on the streets, and vigilantes are beating and, in one instance, killing protesters. And it's leading a major strike of immigrant textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which saw 20,000 workers from 40 different nationalities lead an ultimately successful strike to raise wages and improve conditions. This is all happening in this pivotal election year. The Socialist Party has 118,000 registered members, more than 300 publications in 17 languages published throughout the country, with a combined circulation of over 2 million copies, and probably even more readers. And 600 candidates have, by 1912, been elected to various local offices. So, Debs is the perpetual Socialist Party candidate. This is his fourth time running for president. His vice presidential candidate, Emil Seidel, is the former socialist mayor of Milwaukee, who served from 1910 to 1912. They travel throughout the country on a very hectic schedule on a specially chartered train that's dubbed the Red Special, making stops, speaking to crowds from the rear of the train, building up a lot of excitement. And ultimately, the electoral results that Professor Suri mentioned at the beginning were both impressive and disappointing. Debs won 6% of the popular vote, close to 1 million votes. On the one hand, 6% is obviously very far from winning. On the other hand, this makes Debs one of only 12 candidates in American history running on as a third party to garner more than 5% of the popular vote. And Roosevelt, the same year, was one of the other 12. The last person to do so was Ross Perot, as the third party candidate to get more than 5%. So it's a very significant showing. In Texas, because since we're in Texas, he performs even better, garnering almost 8.5% of the popular vote in Texas, almost as much as Taft. Just wanted that to sink in. The socialist candidate in 1912 for president got almost the same, and almost as much as Roosevelt, for that matter. A very different kind of red state, you could say. But 1912 is really the high point, the pinnacle of Debs' influence and popularity, and the high point of the Socialist Party of America. County by county, even in places like Texas, it could garner as much as 25% of the popular vote, but doesn't get a single electoral vote. And there are a number of events that follow shortly after that really undermine the Socialist Party and Debs' own ability to influence change. One is the Russian Revolution happens in 1917, causes a major split amongst American radicals and socialists between the newly formed Communist Party and the Social Democratic Socialist Party of America. The first Red Scare, which happens right after World War I, sees local and federal repression of all sorts of alleged subversives and radicals. And then the economic boom of the 1920s also undermines socialism's appeal to many workers who, for, in many cases, the first time feel some measure of economic security. Debs himself is arrested in 1918 for making a speech against America's participation in World War I. This is under the Sedition Act, which makes it a federal crime punishable by 20 years to speak against the war. He's sent to prison, sentenced to 20 years. In 1920, while he's in federal prison, he runs for president for a 5th time and gets even more votes than he did in 1912. 913,000, but it's a smaller share of the overall electorate because that has increased in size. Still, the best turnout, the best votes for any federal prisoner in American history in 1920. But really, that experience in prison breaks Debs' health. Among other things, he's pardoned, or his sentence is commuted in 1921 by President Harding, but he emerges ill and relatively infirm and dies in 1926, having really seen the Socialist Party fall apart. But he did not live to see the 1930s, in which a number of planks in the Socialist Party platform would actually come to be reality. Not, obviously, the abolition of capitalism by any means, but a number of the more reformist aspects that they were promoting in 1912 did, in fact, shape later policy. And I think my time is up. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's really nice to be in the company of Kenyon and Crista and Brian and Jeremy and the others. You know, most historians and political scientists consider the election of 1912 to be one of the 4 or 5 most important in American history. And it still has a certain kind of contemporary resonance about it, I think, because 1912 was the first campaign in US history that was about big government. The chief question that Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, the 2 principal candidates, had to grapple with was how the federal government might help to ameliorate the harsher aspects of industrial capitalism while unleashing the full potential of the economy of the United States. Or to put it in a more succinct question, how do you get huge corporations to behave in a socially responsible way within the context of free enterprise capitalism? And that's pretty much what the great debate between those 2 candidates was. To the right of Wilson and TR, you had the incumbent William Howard Taft, who was a very thoughtful conservative, who had serious doubts about what Roosevelt's new nationalism and Wilson's new freedom portended for the Constitution. Taft was perhaps the first Republican presidential candidate to espouse, in modern times anyhow, to espouse a case for limited government. Then, of course, to the left of all 3 of them was Debs, and his particular appeal to reason, I think Kenyon Zimmer would agree with this, was probably more in tune with the spirit of the times than the sitting president. And I think, didn't Debs outpoll Taft in maybe 5 or 6 states? That's really pretty amazing when you think about that. It's interesting to know also that the historian Frederick Jackson Turner, the author of the famous Frontier Thesis in American History, once observed about the progressive era, and I'm quoting him here, "The age of machinery, of the factory, was also the age of socialistic inquiry." And few politicians were more sensitive to that fact than Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. As progressives, they both would do combat with the new industrial corporate class. Of course, progressivism had an immense variety to it because it was many movements all at once. But for Roosevelt and Wilson, I think it was primarily about three things: politics, political economy, and ultimately the conditions of work in the American workplace. After all, they had come of age during the time that Professor Zimmer just described, during these turbulent final decades of the 19th century when the U.S. became really the mightiest agricultural and industrial machine on the earth, an era characterized by incredible growth in the nation's industrial output, by enormous concentrations of wealth and power within a small number of corporations, and by massive unemployment. In the 1890s, it sparked hundreds of strikes and widespread violence. All those basics are important to know, but the most telling thing I think I can offer to help students understand what called this new era of big government into being is the fact that the United States then was indeed the most dangerous workplace in the world. It's interesting if you put those statistics on the killed in the workplace together. Between 1880 and 1900, that is 700,000 American workers killed in the workplace. That's all of America's dead in the Civil War and World War I combined. Were in the workplace where presumably they're not shooting at you. And that number, of course, does not account for the literally millions of people who suffered serious injury without compensation, and at least 1 in 5 of America's children toiled often 10 hours a day, sometimes more, from the sweatshop, the factory, to the breaker. Now, a lot about progressivism is revealed in TR, and I think it's important to take a look at him first briefly as president in order better to understand 1912. You know, he became the first president, of course, to break up a monopoly, a railroad monopoly, in 1902 in the Northern Securities case, and he charged up that particular hill because Northern Security was in clear violation of the Sherman Act, and it was vulnerable owing to public opinion among farmers of the Northwest who had their grievances against the railroads. It would also serve notice, and this is probably more important for TR, that he, as the steward of the people, intended to check the power of the corporations. I think even more significant were his actions in the anthracite coal strike of that same year. You know, not until Theodore Roosevelt did the working man and woman really have a friend in the White House. This particular strike involved about 150,000 coal miners in the eastern coal fields. They worked a minimum of 60 hours a week, hazardous conditions, and they wanted the 8-hour day, a wage increase, and recognition of the United Mine Workers Union. But the owners of the mines wouldn't even discuss the issues with them, and the strike went on for months and months into the autumn, and Roosevelt judged the owners contemptible for their refusal to just meet these guys halfway. He railed against their, what he called, I'm quoting him, their blindness and violence and unreason. To a friend, he complained, "Do you realize that they are putting a heavy burden on us who stand against socialism, against anarchic disorder?" So he used the bully pulpit of the presidency to turn public opinion against these malefactors of great wealth and forced them to the bargaining table. The miners got the 9-hour day, a 10% wage increase, but no recognition of their union. They'd fight that one another day, and TR let it be known that he carried in his breast pocket an honorary membership card that the Union of Sleeping Car Porters gave to him. So that's the president saying he thinks unions are okay. Those two interventions against corporations helped him win by a landslide a term in his own right in 1904. He's the first president who succeeded an incumbent president by death or what have you, who was elected to a term in his own right. Usually it was the vice presidents who was a dead letter office. In 1906, he pushed through 3 pieces of legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is the forerunner, of course, of the FDA, the Meat Inspection Act, with the help of the socialist Upton Sinclair's muckraking novel, The Jungle, and the Hepburn Act, which was railroad legislation to empower the federal government to set maximum rates. His purpose in expanding the powers of the federal government was not to destroy big business, but to curb its excesses, to destroy privilege, he said, and give to every individual the highest possible value both to himself and the Commonwealth. Now, when his close friend, William Howard Taft, was elected president in 2008, Roosevelt had the good graces to sail off to Africa on behalf of the Smithsonian and thence to Europe for a grand tour. It was said that among certain Republicans, the favorite dinner toast was "Health to the Lions." They were glad to be rid of him. But upon his return, he quickly found out that Taft was an unworthy successor and certainly no progressive. Roosevelt felt betrayed by Taft's missteps and challenged him for renomination in 1912. He said Taft meant well, but meant well feebly. So you had presidential primaries that year. TR entered all 7 of them and won, including Taft's native Ohio. But the one thing Taft was able to accomplish by 4 years was complete control pretty much of the party apparatus, and he was able to prevail at the convention and win renomination. Roosevelt believed the cause of reform had been thwarted by a rigged system, and he decided to chart a daring new course to form a third party. You have distinguished social and economic reformers rallying around him in Chicago. At the convention, Jane Addams proudly seconded his nomination, and the platform was the most advanced to that point in U.S. history. It called for, and this looks like an agenda for reform for the entire 20th century. It called for a minimum wage, for protective legislation for women, the prohibition of child labor, and workmen's compensation. It demanded national presidential primaries and, get this, disclosure of campaign contributions. And finally, the platform endorsed the idea of now a Federal Trade Commission to exercise continuous regulatory authority over business and industry. And TR ignited the convention by appearing in person on stage. He was the first presidential candidate to accept nomination in person at a convention. And when he declared at the end of his confession of faith, "We stand at Armageddon and we do battle for the Lord," the place just went wild, and everybody stood up and sang "Onward Christian Soldiers," and was really glad they came. Nonetheless, from the very start, most people understood what the outcome of this campaign was going to be. The Democrats, knowing that they were virtually choosing the next president of the United States, took 46 ballots to do so, despite the sweltering heat, no air conditioning in Baltimore, and they nominated the governor of New Jersey, who only 2 years before had been a college president, albeit of Princeton University. Wilson was somewhat more conservative than TR in his progressivism in 1912, but he believed, and I'm quoting him here, that modern industrial organization has so distorted competition that the rich and the strong virtually tyrannize the poor and the weak, and that government must boldly make itself an agency of social reform and political control. 2 years governor, he pushed through a number of progressive laws, a Workmen's Compensation Act, public utilities regulation, direct primary, and so on. And he suddenly, almost overnight, became the big hope for the Democratic Party. Roosevelt nonetheless set the terms of the debate. He had moved further to the left since leaving the White House and now actually abjured trust busting. The new nationalism pledged to make the country's vast corporate structure accountable to the public by using federal power to do 2 things. One, to regulate monopolies instead of doing away with them, and to safeguard the rights of working people with federal legislation. Wilson, of course, responded with his New Freedom, a program to rehabilitate democracy, he said. And this was not to be done by regulating, but by restoring and enhancing competition. what did that mean? You could accomplish that, he argued, through new antitrust legislation. That is to say, of the two, Wilson would come across in 1912 as more of the trust buster. So you want to beef up your antitrust law, as well as lower the tariff, and that, of course, was a sectional issue that had been hashed out for a century, actually. And this would create more competition. You break down the big corporations in the smaller units and enhance competition, and that's the new freedom. It opens the way for more participation. He also, of course, advocated creating a more elastic currency system. How he felt about federal legislation to protect workers was not altogether clear, but that had very little effect on the election. It carried 40 states, 42% of the popular vote to Roosevelt's 27, Taft's 23, and Debs' 6. But you know, you might say that the impact of progressivism on the two main parties, in tandem with the relative success of the Socialist Party, had caused a certain blurring of traditional political lines in 1912. To millions of citizens, a vote for either Wilson, the progressive Democrat, Roosevelt, the insurgent bull moose, or Debs, the socialist, amounted to something really not seen before or since. And that was, from top to bottom, a protest against the status quo in industrial America on the part of 75% of the American people. Wilson's inauguration opened something of a new chapter in the modern presidency and had implications for both the new freedom and the new nationalism. Wilson was actually the first president to address Congress in person since John Adams. Thomas Jefferson had stopped that practice because it smacked too much of the stump speech from the throne in opening Parliament, and no one did it. TR probably wished he had thought of it himself, but Wilson did it the day after he was inaugurated and delivered his tariff message. He addressed Congress more times than any president to this day. He was also the first to hold regular press conferences and probably the last to write practically all of his own speeches himself. He revitalized the notion of party government. It acted sort of like a prime minister because he carried in majorities, which he'd had for 6 years. And he sat in on committee meetings on Capitol Hill and drove the Democrats, who now, as I say, enjoyed majorities, toward their legislative goals. And his methods resulted in a historic breakthrough, several of them actually. In October 1913, Congress enacted the Underwood-Simmons Bill, which was the first downward revision of the tariff since before the Civil War, 40% lowering of all tariffs across the board. That was the New Freedom's initial assault on the special interest. This was followed by a complete restructuring of the currency system. There had been no real financial or banking legislation in the United States since the Civil War, and our economy was greater than that of Great Britain, France, and Germany combined, probably quintupled since the Civil War in its GNP. And what we're talking about here, of course, is the Federal Reserve Act, which helped to curb Wall Street's domination over the nation's finances and balance the interests of small banks and large banks by establishing the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks like the one here in Dallas. And also through the creation of the Federal Reserve Board, it imposed federal supervision over the whole complex. And the Fed is generally regarded as Wilson's single greatest legislative accomplishment. Now, in grappling with this issue of the trusts, he really brought about something of a merger of the new freedom and the new nationalism. In the fall of 1914, he signed the Clayton Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. It was a law of modest scope. It's still our main antitrust law on the books. But then, upon the urging of progressives, he at last endorsed Roosevelt's proposition of a federal agency empowered to exercise continuous governmental supervisory authority over big business in the Federal Trade Commission Act, September 1914. On the second anniversary of his inauguration, he signed the long-stymied bill to establish and uphold safety standards for America's maritime workers. In 2 years, Wilson had accomplished more than most presidents do in 2 terms. Yet Wilson would not have been continued in office if he had not been willing and able to move further to the left of center in American politics. The Democrats, since the days of McKinley, had been the minority party, and they prevailed in 1912 only because of a split between Taft and Roosevelt. And by 1916, the two of them had reconciled, and it appeared that Wilson was going to be a one-term president. That winter, however, Wilson created a sensation when he appointed Louis Brandeis, the people's lawyer, hated by powerful corporate interests, to the Supreme Court. Then, in the summer, he secured passage of the two most significant social welfare laws theretofore in American history: the Keating-Owen Bill, which imposed restrictions on child labor at last, and the Adamson Act, which established the 8-hour day for 400,000 railroad workers overnight. Finally, he signed the revenue bill, weighted against corporations and the wealthy to pay for a military preparedness program. Now, Wilson's leadership in the enactment of these measures, in tandem with his having kept the country out of war for 2.5 years, probably secured his reelection. His legislation elicited praise from every quarter, but especially from the progressive left. It's estimated that probably maybe a third of those people who voted for Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 came over to Wilson, and probably 300,000 to 400,000 of those who voted for Debs also came over to Wilson. Alan Benson was the candidate in 1916 for the Socialists. Debs sat that one out. But nationally, about 1,250,000 socialist ballots were cast at the local level. And in any case, it's a pretty good bet that those votes went to Wilson. Overall, he improved the number by more than 3 million votes. That's a lot when you're talking about 10 or 15 million votes altogether in 1916. And in the autumn of 1916, you have Jane Addams and John Reed endorsing his reelection. And I always love this one, Mother Jones, who was the 82-year-old crusader for the rights of working people, very salty, pronounced Wilson, and I'm quoting her, the first president ever to demand that the toilers be given an even break. I'm a socialist, she said, but I admire Wilson for the things he has done. And so he had this coalition come together that put him over the top. And so what we have here finally in this 4 years, this one first term of Wilson's, a kind of consummation, a kind of high watermark for progressive reform, amalgamating both the ideas of the new freedom and the new nationalism. Just a couple more things in closing. This kind of governmental activism probably would not have seemed necessary during the preceding century, when classical or laissez-faire liberalism had nurtured individual enterprise and expanded the privileges of democracy. But now, this old Jeffersonian notion of that which governs least governs best was simply inadequate. For most progressive reformers, the goals of liberalism had stayed the same, which was to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty. The means of achieving them, of necessity, had changed dramatically. And so these two archetypal progressives, Roosevelt and Wilson, sought not revolution, but orderly change and some semblance of decency. As events played out, they achieved enough of both to undermine the radical appeal. But I don't think that Roosevelt and Wilson exerted themselves to alleviate the worst aspects of industrial capitalism merely in order to preserve it. I think it's fair to say that they also recognized untapped potential among working people and their children. There can be no equality of opportunity, Wilson said in his first inaugural address, if men and women and children be not shielded in their lives from the consequences of great industrial and social processes which they cannot alter, control, or singly cope with. Even so, I think one could still wonder whether Roosevelt and Wilson would have so recast liberal politics in the absence of concerted pressure from quarters to their left. And however one might answer that question, clearly they both apprehended the persistence of reaction on the right and the radical challenge of someone like Debs to the left of liberalism. For them, for Roosevelt and Wilson, the progressives' approach seemed the irreducible minimum for any efficient and humane form of government that called itself a democracy. Okay, thank you.
Oh, they're all leaving. Just in time for the women. Okay. The presidential election of 1912 played a crucial role in launching women into politics in the 20th century. All of the aspects of women's political participation that I'm going to discuss today had roots in the 19th century. But during the election of 1912, greater numbers of women than ever before became involved in political affairs, and their political activities garnered far more national attention and acceptance than in the past. In the time that I have today, I'm going to talk briefly about 4 groups of women involved in political activities of various kinds at the turn of the 20th century: reformers, suffragists, party women, and feminists. My goal is to tell you a little bit about each of them and the relationship among them so that you can see the range and complexity of women's political activism at the turn of the century, how all of that activism was brought to bear on the presidential election in 1912, and what the election meant for women's political activity going forward. As we will see, these groups were both overlapping and distinct. So on the one hand, many women who were dedicated to social reform were also involved in party politics and the struggle for the vote. Indeed, by 1912, many women devoted to remedying the social ills that attended advanced industrial capitalism were recognizing that partisan involvement and the vote were political tools that were essential for achieving their social housekeeping agendas. On the other hand, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, also known as the NASA, was officially nonpartisan and justified women's suffrage by claiming that women would be better citizens than men because they were naturally less likely to succumb to the egotism and conflict inherent in party politics. Okay, so first the reformers. Women's involvement in organized social reform efforts dates back to the early 19th century. In response to the dramatic political and economic changes wrought by the creation of a democratic republic and the advent of industrial capitalism, women joined, formed, and ran charitable societies devoted to ameliorating the suffering of the poor, the sick, the orphaned, and the widowed. Women also participated in and spearheaded campaigns on behalf of such causes as moral reform, temperance, workers' rights, and abolitionism. Antebellum women reformers were motivated by a desire to protect the vulnerable and to preserve social and moral order in the face of a rapidly changing society. While we would deem much of what these women did to be political, circulating petitions, raising money, giving lectures, lobbying officials, early 19th century women reformers did not see it that way. Politics, which encompassed joining political parties, campaigning, voting, and office holding, was what men did. In contrast, women reformers saw themselves as extending their natural feminine proclivities for care and compassion beyond the home and family into the public realm, endeavors that they thought were necessary for social stability and progress, but were not, in 19th century terms, political. In the decades following the Civil War, the processes of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration converged to forge the United States into a modern nation. As we have already seen, this transformation gave rise to a huge wealth gap and contributed to economic hardship for many rural Americans and to tremendous suffering among the urban immigrant poor who lived and worked in the most dire of conditions. As in the antebellum period, women responded by organizing clubs and societies dedicated to ameliorating the worst ills of industrial capitalism, especially those affecting poor women and children. Low wages and long hours of women factory workers, child labor, juvenile delinquency, overcrowded living conditions in tenement houses, infant mortality, and prostitution. The women's club movement began on the local level, but quite quickly spurred the formation of very large state federations and national organizations. For example, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest and most influential women's organization of the late 19th century, was founded in 1874, the General Federation of Women's Clubs in 1890, the National Council of Jewish Women in 1893, and the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. Women reformers of all kinds justified their growing presence in public life with the logic and rhetoric of what historians call maternalism. They argued that as mothers and as potential mothers, women were called on to extend the feminine values of cooperation, compassion, and care beyond the home to shape public behavior and to remake society. Especially in response to the devastating economic depression of the 1890s, women reformers increasingly advocated for an expanded role for the government in guaranteeing the basic well-being of the citizenry. Hence, women's organizations worked to secure the passage of legislation that would institute the social changes that they sought. For example, state laws mandating maximum hours and minimum wages for women working in factories. They also advocated for the creation of government welfare agencies that would implement, monitor, and agitate for reform from within the government itself. A good example of that is the establishment of the Federal Children's Bureau in 1912. So two big examples of these trends of women in social reform. One I already mentioned, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Here is Frances Willard, who served as the president of the WCTU in 1879, tremendously effective, charismatic leader until her death in 1898. This was one of her favorite sayings. Woman will bless and brighten every place she enters, and she will enter every place. So the idea that women have something special to contribute by virtue of their feminine values of nurture and care, but that they very much belong in the public sphere and that those values belong in the public sphere. Willard's overall goal, she said, was to, for the WCTU was to make the whole world more home-like. And to that end, she pursued what she called a do-everything agenda that entailed many legislative initiatives. So, of course, the WCTU advocated for the passage of laws that would prohibit the sale of alcohol, but that would also guarantee the 8-hour workday, that would abolish child labor, that would raise the age of consent, that would establish public kindergartens, and that would institute government censorship of immoral magazines and books and theater and eventually the movies. A second good example of all of this, of course, is Jane Addams and the Settlement House movement. Jane Addams, with her friend and colleague Ellen Gates Starr, founded Hull House on the west side of Chicago in 1889. Hull House was at the forefront of a rapidly growing settlement house movement in the United States, organized and run almost exclusively by women. Because of her work at Hull House, Jane Addams quickly rose to prominence as the most well-known and most beloved woman in America. Hull House initially set out to meet the cultural and spiritual needs of Chicago's immigrant poor, but very quickly it began to attend to their material needs as well. And here you see an example of the nursery at Hull House, so taking care of babies while their mothers could go to work. Residents of Hull House also became actively involved in advocating for laws and policies that would promote social and economic justice on a systemic level. So by the election of 1912, women were highly active in public life. They were devoted to a whole range of issues aimed at improving society and were increasingly interested in the role that both politics and government could play in advancing their social reform agendas. The second group of women active in public life in 1912 were the suffragists. The former struggle for the vote began in 1848. The Declaration of Sentiments, which was the manifesto that was issued at the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, laid out a broad-based agenda for advancing women's equality in marriage, in education, in employment, and the church. The resolution calling for the right to vote was actually the most controversial at the Seneca Falls Convention. Following the Civil War, women's rights activists disagreed over whether to support the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which guaranteed the voting rights of black men, but not of women. As a result of the disagreement, in 1869, they split into two rival women's suffrage organizations, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. Suffragists referred to the period between 1869 and 1910 as the doldrums. Between 1869 and 1896, only 4 states granted women the right to vote: Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. And between 1896 and 1910, no other states granted women full and equal suffrage rights. Thus, throughout the end of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th, women's suffrage remained a small, much maligned movement, unable to make much headway. Even so, there were some important developments in these years. In the campaigns that succeeded and those that failed, women were cultivating political skills that they would continue to build upon as the movement grew. In the states where women could vote, women were garnering clout as voters, and they were also demonstrating to the American people that the family and the nation would not collapse if women were granted the elective franchise. In 1890, the AWSA and the NWSA merged to form the NASA, which was one of the 2 major suffrage organizations that would lead the movement to victory in 1920. The most important development that led to the expansion of the suffrage movement occurred after 1900 in relation to the larger climate of progressive reform. And here is where the reformers and the suffragists come together. As I've already suggested, many reformers began to see that women needed the vote if they were going to be able to achieve the social reforms that they desired. And Frances Willard is a good early example of this. The WCTU officially endorsed women's suffrage in 1881. Willard herself said that she was called by God to support women's suffrage, and she advocated for the home protection ballot. It was in this climate of reform that the NASA fashioned its main argument for women's suffrage in the progressive era. In the 19th century women's rights movement, the main argument for suffrage was an equal rights argument. The idea that women share a common humanity with men and are entitled to the vote because it is their natural right as individuals in a democracy. The equal rights argument never disappeared, but in the progressive era, it was overshadowed by a difference argument. The notion that women possess a different and morally superior set of values from men, and they are going to use the vote in order to clean up politics and improve society. And we can see that idea reflected in these couple of suffrage ads from the 1910. Jane Addams is a good example of the intertwining of the currents of social reform and suffrage. Addams's most important goal was the achievement of a progressive social agenda. She was also an advocate for suffrage. She became a vice president of the NASA in 1911, and the year before, 1910, she published the article Why Women Should Vote in the Ladies' Home Journal, which was one of the most popular and influential pro-suffrage documents of the progressive era. And we're going to talk a little bit about that document in the breakout sessions. But the document itself reflects the emphasis on the vote as a tool rather than an equal right, right? So the title of the document and the essence of the document is not why women should have the vote, but why women should vote, what women will do with the vote once they have it. So the suffrage movement had been growing both in numbers and in respectability since around 1900, in large part because of its association with progressive reform. The tide began to turn rather dramatically after 1910, when women won the right to vote in Washington state, and the following year they won the right to vote in California. One thing that this meant is that the electoral college vote that women could now affect more than doubled. In 1912, this fact, along with women's demonstrated political efficacy as reformers, convinced all of the presidential candidates that women were a force to be reckoned with, and indeed a force that needed to be harnessed if victory in this highly competitive race was to be theirs. And so this brings us to the next group of women that we want to talk about, the party women. In the 1912 election, women turned to political parties, and political parties turned to women as never before. Throughout the 19th century, women had become increasingly involved in party politics. Although they lacked formal power in the party system and could not vote, they took seriously their role as influencers of male voters and worked hard on behalf of the candidates and parties they cared about. They gave speeches and produced and distributed campaign literature. They attended street rallies, parades, and camp meetings, and they also cooked for and cleaned up after these events, no surprise there. They formed women's campaign clubs and raised money. They canvassed voters and voters' wives. Some served as delegates to state and national party conventions, and some ran for office as party candidates. Of the major parties, the Federalists, the Whigs, and then the Republicans did more to recognize, utilize, and organize women than the Democrats did. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women were especially active in third parties, most notably the Prohibition, Populist, and Socialist parties, because it was in these parties where women's reformist sensibilities most readily found a home. Each of those three parties also supported suffrage, although not consistently. This was also true in the election of 1912. More women were drawn into the Progressive Party than either of the other two major parties. The progressive parties, we've already heard, pledged to enact a whole array of social reforms for which women had long been advocating, including the abolition of child labor, protective labor legislation for women workers, and the adoption of a system of social insurance. Although early in his political career, TR was a tepid, his word, supporter of suffrage, and did nothing to advance the cause of women's rights during his presidency, by the spring of 1912, he had changed his mind. In a speech that he gave in Vermont in August of 1912, claiming to have been influenced by the work of Jane Addams and other women reformers like her who pledged to use the vote to better society, he declared, "Real issues affect women precisely as much as men. The women who bear children and attend to their own homes have precisely the same right to speak in politics that their husbands have, who are the fathers of their children and who work to keep up their homes. I do not believe that there is identity in functions between men and women, but I do believe that there should be an equality of rights." As a result of TR's support and of progressive women's vigilance, the Progressive Party platform contained a plank in support of women's suffrage, and the Progressive Party made women's suffrage an active issue in the campaign. Many women reformers responded enthusiastically to the Progressive Party's vision for change. Even before the party was launched, they formed women's Roosevelt Leagues, which helped TR win the California primary in May. In the convention in August, as Professor Knock already said, Jane Addams proudly seconded his nomination, for which she received some criticism from the NASA for her partisanship. Between 12 and 40 women served as official delegates to the convention, compared to 2 each at the Democratic and Republican conventions. 4 women sat on the National Executive Committee, and women helped to write the party platform. Once the campaign was underway, women formed a separate National Finance Committee and staffed Bull Moose stores in Chicago and New York to raise money. They organized women's rallies in various cities, and they even formed a Jane Addams chorus to sing the party's praises at events around the country. The Progressive Party's appeal to women led the Republicans and the Democrats to reach out to them as well. In 1888, the Republican Party had invited women to form the Women's National Republican Association. Its director, Helen Boswell, spearheaded women's work in the 1912 election. Boswell and her staff cultivated a network of women leaders at the state and county levels who worked to get out the women's vote in the suffrage states, recruited and trained women speakers, generated campaign literature, and drummed up press coverage for the Republican Party. Boswell and other Republican women leaders sought to win women over to Taft by emphasizing the Republican Party's pledge to enact policies that would protect women, children, and workers. They also related one of the major issues in the campaign, the tariff, to women's concerns as homemakers. Using a doll, known as the Protective Tariff Lady, to demonstrate their case, they contended that a woman who was the wife of a man of modest means could indeed afford to purchase clothing that was all made in America. The protective tariff was not the cause of the high cost of living, Republican women argued. Rather, it was essential to preserving American men's high wages, which enabled their wives to purchase consumer goods in the first place. For his part, Taft avoided the issue of women's suffrage during the campaign. His official position, conveyed earlier, was that he would wait for, quote, a substantial call from that sex before the suffrage is extended. Although Boswell was personally in favor of suffrage, the Women's National Republican Association did not address it. By showing themselves to be informed on the issues and doing the party work that needed to be done, Boswell believed women would prove themselves worthy of the vote, and it would be granted to them when the time was right. The Democratic Party had long been the most reluctant to support women's participation in politics. Indeed, the 1912 election was the first time that the DNC officially endorsed women's campaign work. Democratic women founded 2 national organizations, the Women's National Democratic League and the Women's National Wilson and Marshall Association. As progressive and Republican women did for their candidates, Democratic women sought to convince women who could vote to vote for Wilson and to encourage those who could not vote to influence their husbands to do so. To that end, they organized mass meetings aimed at women, gave speeches, generated and circulated campaign literature, and raised money. Democratic women organizers sought to appeal to women by emphasizing Wilson's record on protective labor legislation in New Jersey and made the case that the high cost of living would be alleviated through the reduction of the tariff. Wilson welcomed women's political participation, explaining that as the government became increasingly concerned with securing the public welfare, women would and should have a larger role to play in public affairs. So shortly after accepting his party's nomination, he declared, "And so when the women come into politics, they come in to show us all those little contacts between life and politics, on account of which I for myself rejoice that they have come to our assistance. They will be as indispensable as they are delightful." Such delight did not extend to the prospect of women's suffrage, however. In 1912, Wilson was personally opposed to suffrage, and when pressed by suffragists, insisted that it was a matter for the states to decide. Like their Republican counterparts, many leading Democratic women personally supported suffrage, but sought to keep it separate from their party activism. The final group of women involved in public life during the early decades of the 20th century were feminists. The word feminism came into use in the United States in the 1910s. It referred to the beliefs of a younger generation of women's rights activists who sought a far-reaching agenda for women's emancipation and gender equality. In the 19th century, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other women's rights activists had advocated for women's freedom and equality in many areas of public and private life. During the early 20th century, as the NASA sought to render suffrage appealing to a mass audience, it jettisoned the more radical aspects of the women's rights agenda and focused exclusively on winning women the right to vote. The feminists of the 1910s, many of whom were associated with the political left and the cultural and intellectual avant-garde, sought to resurrect and expand on a radical women's rights agenda. In 1912, a group of feminists in Greenwich Village formed a group called Heterodoxy, and as you can see in this call for a feminist mass meeting from 1914, feminists argued for women's full political equality, sexual freedom, economic independence, and psychological emancipation. Although all suffragists were not feminists by far, all feminists were in favor of suffrage, and they infused the suffrage movement with a vibrancy and a militancy that would be vital to the final winning of the vote in 1920. At the forefront of these efforts was Alice Paul, a young Quaker woman from Pennsylvania who had participated in the British suffrage movement, which was far more militant than the American movement. British activists marched in the streets, they went on hunger strikes, they chained themselves to lampposts, and they attacked the party in power. In 1912, Paul and her friend and colleague Lucy Burns convinced the NASA leadership to allow them to revive efforts to secure a federal amendment to the Constitution. The NASA's main strategy up to that point had been to focus on amending state constitutions. To garner national attention for their cause, they organized a massive suffrage parade to be held in Washington, D.C. on March 3, 1913, the day before President Wilson's inauguration. The parade generated a great deal of publicity, but when Paul and Burns saw that the NASA would not build on this momentum, they formed a separate suffrage organization called the Congressional Union and broke away from the NASA. In 1916, the Congressional Union was renamed the National Woman's Party. The National Woman's Party was at the forefront of the crusade for a federal suffrage amendment. It also revived the equal rights argument for women's suffrage. Alice Paul famously said that she did not care what women used the vote for. It was her goal to secure for them this basic equal right of citizenship. The National Women's Party held the party in power responsible for the failure of women's suffrage, engaging in a kind of partisanship that the NASA found abhorrent. It also pioneered with the use of militant tactics. Most notably, in January of 1917, its members began picketing the White House. They were the first group in U.S. history to do so. When they were arrested and jailed, they carried out hunger strikes in prison. Most historians agree that it was the combination of efforts by the NASA and the NWP, all underway in 1912, that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment by Congress in 1919 and its ratification by the states in 1920. So what did women mean to the 1912 election, and what did the 1912 election mean to women? First, roughly 1/2 of the 1.3 million women who were eligible to vote in 1912 did so. Historians cannot conclusively say whether women's suffrage made a difference in the outcome of the election. Of the 6 states where women could vote, TR took California and Washington, Taft won in Utah, and Wilson prevailed in Colorado, Idaho, and Wyoming. We don't know how women voted in these states, but it is likely that women voters were responsible for TR's narrow victory in California. Without question, the election of 1912 provided a boost to the suffrage cause. In 1912, women won the right to vote in 3 more states, Kansas, Oregon, and Arizona, and the mass media also stepped up its coverage of the issue. The following year, a record number of suffrage bills were introduced into state legislatures. Although women's suffrage remained a matter of debate within the major parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans finally included a suffrage plank in their party platforms in 1916. Finally, and more broadly, we can say that women's public activism, their contributions as reformers, suffragists, party women, and feminists leading up to the 1912 election and continuing beyond it, helped to reshape the meaning of politics and expectations for the roles of government in the 20th century. During the 20th century, politics increasingly came to entail not only voting, running for office, and governing, but also educating the public about social problems, shaping public opinion, and lobbying public officials to adopt particular policies, activities that women activists of various kinds had long pioneered. And while the political parties would continue to debate how involved the government should be in providing for the common welfare, by 1912, there was a growing consensus that the government ought to take some responsibility for protecting the well-being of its citizens, especially the most vulnerable. Again, a development that women's long history of public activism certainly helped to foster. The election of 1912 thus opened up new opportunities for women activists of various kinds to pursue their distinct agendas and to interact with one another in ways that would have consequences both for women's political participation and for American politics more broadly for decades to come. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all 3 of you. I want to call a little bit of an audible on our schedule here since we're running a little behind, but I want to give everyone a chance to breathe a little bit. And then what I'd like to do, if you want to mark this on your schedules, we're just going to still do 2 sessions, but shorten them both just a little so we have a little bit of space in between, okay? So the first session, we're going to go from 5 to 5:20, and then you'll have a short break, and we'll do the second session from 5:25 to 5:45. Okay, so the first one, 5 to 5:20, the second one, 5:25 to 5:45, and then just come back up here at 10 till, and we'll just have a quick kind of closing remarks together. So in that brief few minutes you have, if you want to get a little bit of food or drink, please feel free to do that. And let me remind you again real quick where the rooms are. We're not going to do a group Q&A right now, but I'm sure you have questions that were sparked by these presentations. So bring your questions to those breakout sessions, and those are a great chance to both look at documents and go into some of these issues a little more. Dr. Deluzio, Crista Deluzio will be in room 115, Thomas Knock in room 116, and Kenyon Zimmer in room 152. Okay, if you have any questions, please come find me or one of the staff from Humanities Texas in the back. But let's convene for that first session at 5 o'clock sharp on the first floor.